How'd it go this week? Did you make it through? These are some very difficult books for reading, so if you're still with us, you're doing great. Keep up the good work. A lot of what we read this week had to do with law, and so we have to understand a little bit about law. Some of the things that you read, you said, those aren't things I could even do if I wanted to do, because society has changed, culture has changed. Other things you thought, why in the world wouldn't they be able to do that? We read portions like this and we say, you know, this is in my Bible, so I know it's supposed to be important, but I don't know how it's important to me. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with this. If this is God's revelation of himself, then what am I supposed to get out of this? One of the key things that you have to think about is that in the end, the law is part of God's revelation of himself. When he reveals the law, he's revealing a lot about who he is, what he is like, and the kinds of things that are important to him. Now, in that regard, you noticed a couple themes coming up over and over again. One of the first ones that you noticed was the idea of holiness. There's a lot of confusion about holiness, and so we better take a moment to explain it. When we talk about God's holiness, that's not just one characteristic along with lots of others, that God is just and God is merciful and God is compassionate and God is loving and God is holy. It's not one alongside the others. Rather, holiness is the result of all of the other attributes. Everything that God is together is what makes him holy. And that holiness separates him from us, because it shows who he is, that he's different from what we are. When we are called upon to be holy, God also wants us then to separate ourselves out from those around us. How do we do that? We do that by being godlike. When we begin to imitate God's attributes, when we begin to reflect them in our lives, that is what will distinguish us from people around us. When we get to the New Testament, you'll see that reflected in things like the gifts of the Spirit. So that we are holy when we are acting godlike. God is holy when he is being God, which is all the time, of course. That's what holiness is about, imitating God. The law is designed to help us do that, to help us live in a way that we can be like God. It has authority to us, not so much as individual laws that we are expected to keep, because of course, again, culture has changed. It has authority to us as part of God's revelation of himself, because God has not changed. Now, some of the things that confuse us about the law are things that have to do with caring for his presence. Remember, at the end of Exodus, God's presence came down, dwelt in the tabernacle, so that now he could be in the midst of his people, and so that they could relate to him. This was an initiative by God. That initiative regarding his presence, remember, started back with the covenant, where God took initiative to establish a relationship, to begin working toward setting up his presence again. He's also in the process of revealing himself so we can know him, so that we can be in relationship with him. Now, that revelation presence idea is really part of God's solution to what I would call the Babel problem. Remember, the Tower of Babel was an aborted attempt to bring God down, to relate to God in their own distorted ways. And God's going to resolve that Babel problem by revealing what he's really like, and by dwelling with his people on his terms. And that's what happened. That was the initiative that started with the covenant, as God began revealing himself. And then it proceeded in with the tabernacle, as God took up his presence among his people and began to show what he was really like, because lots of people had a distorted idea about God. Lots of us have a distorted idea about God. That's why we're reading the Bible. so that we can get a clear picture that's accurate from God himself. Now, once God takes up his residence among his people, it's important then that people respond to him properly. We have to make sure that we're handling all of that the way we should, recognizing God's holiness and relating to him in the ways that we need to. You saw that Leviticus talked a lot about not only holiness, but cleanness or uncleanness. And you probably noticed that some of the things that make a person unclean are things they couldn't help. They weren't necessarily sin or error or something of that sort. They were things that just happen in life that could make one unclean. But yet God communicated to the people that it was important that his presence be something that is honored and respected in lots of different ways. And there are certain inappropriate aspects of life that didn't belong there. When we think of cleanness, maybe it might help us to think in terms of how we consider radiation. If we knew that we were going to come in contact with something that was radioactive, we would be very concerned to take all of the right precautions, to have the right clothing on and the right covering and all taped up and make sure that we did everything just right, because we know that that's dangerous stuff. And we want to make sure that we do it right. Now, if it's dangerous stuff, why do we have it around? Well, because there are some benefits, advantages. Same thing with electricity. We know that electricity can be dangerous, life-threatening, and so it has to be handled properly. But the great benefits of electricity make it worthwhile. That's how it was with God's presence. Having God's presence in their midst was a great privilege, a great benefit. Again, to have the God of the universe there dwelling among them and willing to relate to them. They wanted that. But they knew it had to be handled properly, else there was danger. And when the Bible talks about fearing God and fearing the Lord, it's talking about both the relationship side and the danger side, because God is holy. The sacrifices that were described in the early chapters of Leviticus were meant to help the people be able to work with God's presence. The key to the sacrifices was that they were there to make sure that God's presence was kept in its proper condition, because human sin or human uncleanness had a way of desecrating, of dirtying God's presence, and sacrifices needed to take care of that. Sin had a way of doing that. And if God's presence was not kept in its proper condition, then God would not be pleased to dwell in their midst any longer. The sacrifices were done at the temple, and they were the main form of worship that the Israelites used. Now, they didn't come to church each week like we do. And the temple is not like a church. That is, it's not a place where people gather for worship on a regular basis. There was no space in the tabernacle or the temple when it was finally built for large crowds of people to gather all at once. As the architecture developed later on in the New Testament, there was a little more room for that. But this was not a place where people gathered for worship. This was a place where God dwelt. That's a different thing. And so, in one sense, you can think of this, the inner sanctum. Sometimes we call it the Holy of Holies, the place in the very center where God's presence was, where there was no access. The high priest once a year could go in there. There was no access to that inner sanctum. If we think of that a little bit like the Oval Office. The Oval Office is a place where the work of the country is done. That's the president's inner sanctum. Not anybody can have access to that. You can't just walk in, decide to look around, have a little conversation, and go your way. It's controlled access. And it's controlled access so that the work that needs to be done can be done there. When God is in his temple, he's in there running the world, in a sense. That's the hub, it's the control room where all of the work of running, ordering this world take place. And so there's a controlled access to all of that. In one sense, then, the priests are a little bit like the Secret Service. We often think that the priests were involved in rituals, and certainly they were. They were the ritual experts. We also think of the priests as teaching and instructing. And they were instructing in the law because that had to do with relating to God and honoring His presence. So they were doing those things, but they were also guards. They were like the Secret Service, controlling access, making sure nobody gets through that checkpoint who is not qualified to do so. That's how important God's presence was, and needed to be treated with all of that respect. Now, getting ahead of myself a little bit, today as Christians, we don't have the presence of God in a building. We have the presence of God in us, in His people, individually and corporately. And we need to be just as concerned about caring for God's presence as they were in Leviticus. And lots of times that's what Leviticus can help us with, to see exactly how concerned we have to be to make sure that God's presence is cared for carefully in our lives. The book of Leviticus is focused on God's presence. That's what it's all about. It's not about so much the sin of an individual. The sacrifices addressed the sin of people so that they could renew their relationship with God. God's presence is protected. Relationship with God is promoted. That's what Leviticus is about. Numbers. When we move on to the book of Numbers, we find a book that has two basic aspects to it. The first is the rebellion of the people. Here we find that with all that God had done, all that He had revealed to them about Himself, come and dwelt in their midst, that still somehow they were not trusting. They were unfaithful. We shouldn't blame the Israelites for that. We struggle with the same kinds of things. But the first part of Numbers all has to do with this idea of rebellion. All the different ways, at all the different levels. Numbers also has to do with transition. Did you see the transition? We had the census, the counting of the people early in the book, and then another one toward the end of the book. And we're making this transition from the first generation, the generation who failed, the generation who died in the wilderness. We're making the transition from that generation that had come out of Egypt to the generation that was going to enter the promised land. And that transition comes along with a number of different elements. New leadership. Joshua, who comes into place in the stead of Moses. We have a new blessing given to the people from the oddest place. Balaam, the foreign prophet, who was hired to curse and ends up blessing after being lectured by his donkey. We have this whole idea then of a transition from the generation that failed, who was unfaithful, to a generation now who is prepared to take up the mantle and gain the promises of God in the land. That takes us to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy you have to think of as God's charter. This is the Constitution. This is the renewal of the covenant with this new generation as they prepare to enter the land. Deuteronomy is a charter document. And it rehearses this whole history that has brought them up to this point. And then it lays out the law again. And we don't have time to look into it, but if we looked in detail, we'd see that that law in chapters 12 through 26 follows along with the Ten Commandments. And then finally there's covenant renewal at the end as Moses makes his final speeches to the people. That's what Deuteronomy is about, to give them this kind of summary of the whole thing and prepare them to enter the land and to have the fulfillment of God's blessing in the covenant. The Ten Commandments are an important part of this. They're the centerpiece of God's revelation of Himself through the law, and the part that many people are most familiar with. The Ten Commandments tell us as much about God as they tell us about what God expects from us. When God says, "You shall have no other gods before me," He's making an important statement. We're not talking about that He needs to be the highest God or the highest thing in our lives. When He says before me, He's talking about in His presence. In the ancient world, there were lots of gods. They worked as a committee to run the world. And each one of them had a little slice of authority And God says, no, I don't work that way. God says, I work alone. No other gods are in my presence. Nobody else gets a piece of divine authority. When God says that you shouldn't make images, that has nothing to do with art. He's talking about how God works in this world, because the images in the ancient world were meant to be mediators of God's presence, of God's revelation. And God says, the only image I have is the people that I created. And there is where my presence is supposed to be. When God says that you shouldn't take His name in vain, we're familiar today with the idea of identity theft, where a simple sequence of numbers can be used to steal your authority, to use your economic power. God's name could be used illicitly. God's name could be used to usurp His power. And He said, no, my name's not to be used that way. And even in the New Testament, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. It's like when parents give the kids the credit card and say, go use it wisely. Their own credit card. God has given us His name, His revelation of Himself, and says to use it wisely. That's Leviticus through Deuteronomy. God's revelation of Himself through the law. Next week is going to go a little easier for you. Joshua through 1 Samuel. Some important things going on there. We start to see some more fulfillment of God's promises through the covenant. So as you read, look for covenant items. Look for fulfillment of promises. And most of all, pay attention to who's being an instrument of God's program and who's being an obstacle. We all have that choice, to be instruments or obstacles, to be part of what God's doing in this world, or to be getting in the way. Not that we can really get in God's way, but we can choose to be part of it or not. So we're going to keep an eye out for that next week. So keep up the good work, keep reading, keep encountering God, and we'll see you next week.